Welcome to the Washington Academy of Sciences Executive Board Meeting Special Lecture by Dr. Mark Kortepeter. We're honored to have Dr. Mark here today to do a special lecture from Tales from the Inside of the Hot Zone and Relevance to COVID-19. Dr. Mark Kortepeter is a former Colonel U.S. Army retired, a physician scientist, a soldier, and author of Inside the Hot Zone. Dr. Kortepeter has extensive background in epidemiology and biodefense, including being a deputy commander of the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, which is also known as USAMRIID. And he also has he is a biodefense consultant for the Army Surgeon General and co-chair of NATO's Biomedical Advisory Panel. He has worked with multiple organizations, including the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the CDC, and the National Academy of Medicine. He has also done recent field work as the lead for infection prevention and control against Ebola virus for the World Health Organization, and is a consultant to the Pan American Health Organization against COVID-19 in the Caribbean. He has published over 80 journal articles and book chapters and a medical thriller memoir of his experiencing managing infectious diseases crisis titled Inside the Hot Zone, a soldier on the front lines of biological warfare. He is also a contributor to Forbes COVID-19 Frontline series. And you can also follow him on Twitter for updates. Thank you, Mark, for doing this and doing the special lecture for our board and our members of the Washington Academy of Sciences.
Great, thank you, Dr. Stavely. And it's a pleasure to be here today. And my lecture will be about 35 to 40 minutes. I hope I can keep your attention during that time. And let's go ahead and get started. So as Judy mentioned, I just recently wrote a memoir called Inside the Hot Zone, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in terms of different stories from the book and then after I go through these various things, a national crisis, a lab crisis, and an international crisis, I'll give you some thoughts about the COVID-19 outbreak and how some of the things I bring up in the book are relevant to that. And I'll have a little teaching along the way, hopefully. So for me in my career, this is kind of where it all started. For those of you who know the old TV show MASH with Alan Alda playing here the key character, Hawkeye Pierce. But when I was in college, I used to watch these episodes with my roommates, and both of us wanted to be doctors. And we thought Hawkeye was kind of cool. I didn't ever think I'd actually join the Army, though. I just wanted to be a doctor, kind of like him. And I actually joined the Army because I needed a way to pay for medical school. And I thought, it was something very similar to an ROTC scholarship called a Health Profession Scholarship. And I elected to do it thinking I'd stay in for just my payback, which is 4 years after my initial training. But I never imagined I'd stay in for a career of over 27 years. And it really was just because I was having so much fun. I chose infectious diseases because I liked the idea that someone would come in sick and you go ahead and treat them and you could cure them. But I also did my first training at the Triplet Army Medical Center in Hawaii. And we would get a lot of really interesting exotic patients coming in from parts of the islands or, in the South Pacific area, and then also from military forces from Asia. And so I like the idea of travel. And so doing something like tropical medicine seemed kind of exotic and it gave me opportunities to travel. So I never realized, though, by getting involved in infectious diseases, I might get stationed at a place like this. So this was the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID. And we called it affectionately the Hot Zone. And USAMRIID is the main hub for biodefense for the military. And it also has the specialized containment laboratories, biosafety level 3 and 4 level laboratories for studying some of these highly hazardous agents. You may have heard the term the hot zone before from this book that was a bestseller back in the 1990s by Richard Preston, which chronicles the discovery of the Ebola virus, but it also talks heavily about usamid, where a discovery of a new species of Ebola virus occurred in the 1990s, found in Reston, Virginia. So let's start from some basics. What is biological or germ warfare or terrorism? So it fundamentally means using infectious pathogens or toxins to make people sick in a war or for terrorism. And there are certain pathogens that are deemed to be or to make good biological weapons, quote unquote. And these are listed here. And the CDC calls them the category A threat agents: anthrax, smallpox, plague, tularemia, botulism, and viral hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola. And so they have various properties that make them better as biologic weapons. One being, number one, that a lot of them scare people because they've heard of things like anthrax, smallpox, plague before. They also can be stable in aerosol to spread downwind great distances, and in many cases can be grown up in large quantities if somebody wanted to use them on the battlefield. In my book, I call them the chessmen of doom, and I wanted to find a way that was approachable for people to kind of remember the different properties of these different pathogens. And so just as an example here in chapter 3, I talk about the chessmen of doom, and for using botulinum toxin as an example. Now, botulinum toxin is produced by an organism called Clostridium botulinum, and it's a highly deadly disease. Disease causes paralysis, and it causes the disease botulism. But I call it the pawn of the chess pieces because it only moves 1 or 2 spaces, sort of like the lowly pawn that lived in the, essentially lived and worked and tilled the soil. And because it only moves a couple spaces, it's an ideal bioweapon for assassination. And there are famous stories about people potentially being assassinated with botulinum toxin. So the organism that creates the toxin actually lives in the soil. And it actually can find it in local soil anywhere pretty much, and you can find the spores if you know how to isolate them and actually grow the toxin. So why do we worry about bioweapons? Well, there are many countries around the world we are concerned have bioweapons programs. Now we know for sure that the former Soviet Union, shown in red, and also Iraq had very robust programs. Russia, we still don't know what their program is, but they had a massive program previously. Part of it was disguised in their pharmaceutical organizations around the country in the civilian sector. But the Russian military, we still don't really understand. And China, Iran, North Korea, or other countries we're concerned likely have bioweapons programs. And this is just an example of the size and scale of one of these programs. If you're making bioweapons, the technology to do it is very similar to making something like beer or wine or other pharmaceuticals. It's a fermentation process in most cases. And so these are fermenters in the former Soviet Union, and there are 40 of these. They're 10,000 liter fermenters, and these were ideal and set up to grow and produce Bacillus anthracis, which is the causative organism of anthrax. So this just gives you a snapshot of how large something like this can be. Essentially, they had an industrial process for doing this. What you may not know is that the U.S. Army and the U.S. military had its own biological weapons development program for producing organisms. And it was headquartered where USAMRIID is today at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is just about 30 miles north of the national capital area. And these are some of the organisms that were developed. Bacillus anthracis shown here, which causative agent of anthrax, of course, the botulinum toxin. It's Francisella tularensis for production of tularemia and some other agents. In addition, we are also interested in anti-crop agents like wheat stem rust, rye stem rust. And you can imagine if you can target foreign adversaries, wheat fields or rice or rye fields, things like that, you can actually knock out their ability to produce food for their military personnel. So they can be very powerful as economic weapons as well. So one thing I should mention is that the U.S. disbanded its program in 1969. It went from 1942 all the way to 1969 when President Nixon disbanded the program. So now all we have is a defensive program. So I'm going to start out with the first crisis. It's responding to a national crisis. So you all remember September 11, 2001. And about 3 weeks later, put yourself in this scenario. So it was October 2nd. I came back to my office in an afternoon. On my desk was a note from my boss that said, Mark, Tom Brokaw called. He wants you to call him back. Well, I don't often get calls from Tom Brokaw, who was a very powerful man in the media at the time. So, a couple things went through my mind. Well, is this a joke? Maybe it's a good time to head to the gym. Do I dump this on my deputy chief? Because, it's what else are deputies for, right? Or else, if I call him, who else should I have on the call? Well, I decided it looked like a real call, so I should call him back. And so I gathered a couple colleagues together, and we went ahead and called him. Turns out one of his assistants opened a letter with a white powder a week earlier. It was tested for anthrax by local law enforcement. It was tested negative. Now she has this poorly healing lesion on her shoulder. She's seen multiple physicians without a diagnosis. This is what this lesion looked like. You can see it's a very nice looking black scab, fairly large. So eventually she saw a tropical medicine specialist who said this thing looked like anthrax. So question to us, is this an outbreak? Is it a bioterrorism event? Is this something we need to worry about? Well, let's, in medicine, when we're taught really, when we hear hoofbeats, we're told to think about something that's fairly common coming toward us, like horses, and not something exotic and strange like zebras. So, what do we say to Tom Brokaw? Well, this could be anthrax. It could be a spider bite. Could be an allergic reaction. We don't know what it is. And by the way, at this time, it's 2001. We didn't have the ability to send text messages easily with pictures like nowadays. So I actually didn't see that picture for at least a week after the phone call. But anyway, we said, go ahead and send us a biopsy on wet ice, and we'll take a look. Let's talk a little bit about anthrax. So anthrax is worldwide. We see it mostly in places in the less developed areas of the world, places like sub-Saharan Africa or Asia. But the United States sees cases periodically, and you can see that's why it's in yellow. So sporadic cases. And that's really because of who actually usually gets anthrax. So the people at risk are those who work with large herbivores like sheep, cattle, or goats, because herbivores get infected usually with what's called gastrointestinal anthrax. Usually they get that because the spores live in the soil, and then the animals come along and graze, and while they're eating, they actually ingest spores, and they get sick that way. So the people who get infected usually are farmers, ranchers, shepherders, anybody who works with these large animals or their products, like wool mill workers, bone meal workers, tannery workers, etc. And we also worry about laboratory workers and also the military. So anthrax secretes two toxins when it's growing. One is called the lethal toxin, which causes local cell death. And second is the edema toxin, which causes local swelling. So this leads to two characteristic features of cutaneous anthrax. One is this black scab, or what we call black eschar. And the name for anthrax actually comes because of this black appearance. It comes from the Greek word anthracus for coal. And the second feature is swelling out of proportion to the size of the lesion. So this is a child from Zimbabwe. You can see under child's right eye here, it's a small black scab, but the entire face is swollen. So the black scab is from the local cell death, and then the swelling is from that edema toxin. This is a case I saw when I was in the Republic of Georgia, and this was a shepherd who'd been infected when he had slaughtered a sheep about a week earlier. He came in with these really large lesions on his forearms, and actually he'd been treated with intramuscular penicillin for 3 days by the time I saw him. So a lot of the local swelling had improved by then. But that's cutaneous anthrax. What we really worry about is inhalational anthrax. And so this is what happens here. So someone inhales spores, and they get down deep inside the lungs. They get past your protective mechanisms in your nose and your airway passages here. They get down deep in the lungs, and they lead to it's really a lymphatic disease. So it attacks the lymph nodes here, and it replicates inside the lymph nodes. You get these massive engorged, bloody lymph nodes. And so what happens here is the central part of the chest on the chest x-ray turns white. You can see this, and this is from these lymph nodes. It's also from fluid that fills up in the chest. So instead of this nice black appearance that you see because of the x-ray beam going through air, it gets blocked partially by this, liquid air interface, and then from the blood in these lymph nodes. And so you get what's called a wide mediastinum. And all that means is this central part of the chest, instead of being more narrow, becomes this wide sort of white space. But that's a hallmark feature of inhalational anthrax. So for those of you who are squeamish, you may want to close your eyes, but this is an autopsy of someone who died from this in the former Soviet Union. And this is the trachea, basically the windpipe coming down and then splitting to the main stem bronchi here, leading to both lungs. So here's one lung on the left, one on the right, and this individual is a smoker because the lungs normally are nice and pink, but now they're kind of mottled and bluish and blackish looking. But this is what inhalational anthrax looks like. You've got all this fluid in the central part of the chest, and you can't really make out the lymph nodes, but they're there as well. So eventually it gets into the bloodstream, and you get this large organism here called a bacillus that's in the bloodstream, and it's showering out throughout the body. And you can see here's another great picture showing how it's teeming in the bloodstream of an infected monkey who's dying of anthrax. But it essentially goes throughout the body, and much like metastatic cancer cells, it metastasizes all through the body. And you can see wherever it lands, it causes what I say are called, explosions of death, where you get the local swelling and the local cell death. And you can see the multiple different lesions in the intestines in this one victim. And then it also goes to the lining of the brain, the meninges, causing a bloody meningitis. And that's another hallmark feature of the disease. Well, interestingly, just before 9/11, the Canadian laboratory, which is the equivalent of USAMRIID, decided to do a study to see how quickly spores could spread in a room if they were in an envelope and the envelope was opened. Well, here's where they did this. They opened it at ground zero here, and they looked through the laboratory to see where and how quickly the spores went across the room and down the hallway. And so they were amazed to find 48 seconds it took to get across the hallway, and then down the hallway 96 seconds into another room. So very quick. And word really didn't get out of this until shortly after the anthrax attacks. But as I say in my book in chapter 5, no one could have predicted we were about to experience a real life validation of the Canadian experiment at the seat of our government. So this is what happened. This letter showed up in the Hart Senate building in Washington, D.C. saying, "You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid?" And this is a schematic diagram of the Hart Senate building on the 6th floor where the Daschle office is. And this is where the person opened this at ground zero at the Star. And then pretty much everybody in that room they found had actually had inhaled spores, and they could find them in their nose, including the first responders who showed up and didn't have any personal protective equipment until they got into the room. So they got in the room and already inhaled organisms. And then you had 2 people next door and then 1 person out in the hallway. So it was readily aerosolizable. Well, we ended up getting this letter brought to us at USAMRIID, and this is Johnny Zell. He ran our specialist pathogens laboratory. So he's a highly experienced researcher who'd worked on anthrax for decades. So here's the letter. He opened this in the biosafety level 3 laboratory where he's showing the letter. And he ended up, as he opened this letter, he went to pull the letter inside the biosafety cabinet. As he pulled this letter out of the cabinet, out of the envelope, the spores wafted up off the page and went right in front of his face behind the glass. And it really scared him. And he ended up snorting bleach up his nose and came rushing down to the clinic to see me where we ended up giving him some antibiotics as well as a booster on his anthrax vaccine. But this was an experienced researcher who was used to this, and normally you wouldn't expect to see anthrax like that wafting up off the page, and it frightened him. And I saw him the next day, and he said, "I saw the face of the devil in that cloud of smoke, cloud of spores." Well, what really had gone on is essentially a stampede of zebras that actually arrived on our doorstep. So as we know now, there are at least 5 other letters total that went around. Here's the Tom Brokaw letter in the upper left, and another one went to Senator Leahy. So our response at USAMRIID is we went into 24/7 operations. We became the national hub for diagnostics and the FBI's referral center. I, as the chief of medicine at the time in the institute, I led the management of lab workers who were exposed, as well as the response to contamination outside the laboratory. And even I wasn't immune to being scared. I had to open my mail just like everybody else, and my wife kind of banished me to the garage, and I'd go there, don an N95 mask, and open the mail in the garage. And then one morning I woke up with this horrible sinus pain, and I blew my nose ahead. This frank blood came out. It was quite concerning. And I thought maybe I'd been exposed to anthrax. However, foolishly, as they say, a doctor who treats himself is as a fool for a doctor as well as a patient. I decided not to treat myself, and I didn't even go see anybody. I figured since I'd already been vaccinated by the military for anthrax, I probably didn't need to worry about it, but that probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. So what were some of the lessons learned in this? Well, it's important to keep an open mind for the unexpected. We're not very good at recognizing new things, but in the end, the medical system generally is responsive, and we adapt once we know what's happening. And I think we were able to salvage people once the word got out that anthrax was out. And some of the people who came in later, especially some of the folks from the postal system, ended up being saved with antibiotic treatment. Let's move on to another crisis here from chapter 16. It's response to a laboratory crisis. So I was still the chief of medicine here in 2004. And one afternoon, while I was walking up the hallway toward the nurse's station, one of our virologists rushed around the corner and said, "We have an Ebola exposure in the laboratory." I'm not sure what you might call this, but for me, I would call this a very bad day. We would periodically get exposures in the laboratory, or what we call potential exposures, but something in the BSL-4 laboratory like Ebola was highly rare. So here's the rest of the story. This was a 30-year-old female who was a PhD postdoc, and she was working with 10 mice infected with Ebola 2 days earlier. And what she was doing, she would take the mice and then turn them belly up and then inject them with an antibody preparation in their abdomen. And she was using the same needle and syringe on each mouse in turn. And so she had 10 mice. She was actually on the 5th mouse. And as she was about to inject, the mouse kicked and hit her hand and knocked it off its trajectory and off its normal arc. Essentially, the needle penetrated through 2 layers of her protective gloves and grazed the base of her thumb. And so she actually didn't even know she cut herself until she squeezed her thumb and saw some blood welling up in the gloves. So now she's on her way, showering out of the lab, and she's on her way to our clinic. Now, the frightening thing about this was, of course, we had no countermeasures. And what we knew from Africa was that a needle stick with this species of Ebola, by the way, this was Ebola Zaire, which is the most deadly species. What we knew from Africa was that 100% of people who had needle sticks ended up dying. So we figured she was going to die. This is the enemy. This is Ebola, and it's a filovirus or a filovirus. Comes from the Latin term phylum for thread. And you can see it's under an electron microscope. It's a filamentous-looking virus. And what happens is individuals will come in after they've been infected, and they have high fevers, and they can early on have a rash on their skin. It's kind of hard to see on this individual. It's harder to see with darker skin. But then they can have, a redness in the back of the throat and a sore throat. They can have injection of the conjunctivitis, so they can essentially have a conjunctivitis. So they get the red eyes licked to them. And that's fairly early on. In the next 2 days, they end up getting sort of the wet phase where they start having massive amount of vomiting, diarrhea. And then near the end of the first week is when they really go downhill, where they can start having bleeding. Usually the bleeding isn't like what you see in the movies with people bleeding from their eyeballs and things like that. That's not quite so sexy, but you get usually oozing from IV sites, or they can have bleeding here around the gum line. Or if they're going to have a large amount of bleeding, it's from vomiting up blood or having bloody diarrhea. But despite the frightening, the scariness of the bleeding, bleeding isn't really what kills people. And actually, most of the people don't get bleeding. It's a minority. But if they do get it, it's usually not what kills them. It's the fact they end up going into a shock and then ultimately end organ failure as the cause of death. So Ebola is a very efficient spreader if you have the right environment, if people have direct contact with a person where they have potential contact with their blood or body fluids. And so there are certain places that are high risk. If someone is taking care of patients either in the hospital or the home, or in places like Africa where there's a lot of direct contact with a dead body as part of the funeral rituals, then these you can actually have a large amount of spread related to a funeral, such that if someone pretty high level, like a tribal chief dies, and then everybody in the tribe, in the village comes and touches the dead body, you can have what's called a super spreading event where you get everybody getting infected suddenly. So because of the way it spreads in the hospital environment, we had a facility at Fort Detrick inside the lab called the Slammer. And this is a picture of what the Slammer looks like. If you look very closely, you can see here this inside the window. This is the decontamination shower. So the Slammer was merely an intensive care unit that was also melded with all the capabilities of a biosafety level 4 laboratory. So it had negative pressure, isolation, it had essentially all the ICU trappings, but it also had specialized HEPA filtration of the air leaving the facility. It had a pass-through autoclave, and then the caregivers would wear spacesuits, and then when they would leave, they could leave through this decontamination shower, much like they would in a regular BSL-4 laboratory. So here's me in the real laboratory, and you can see the spacesuit. So, the way this works is that air comes down from the ceiling through these hoses. It's like pressurized air, just like a tire pump. And then there's a HEPA filter on the side of the suit here. So you can go ahead and hook up, you let the suit inflate till it's full, and then you can unhook and then walk around the lab. And then as you're breathing for a while, you'll start noticing your visor starts fogging up. And so then you have to go ahead and re-hook up. But you have these sort of slinky-like hoses hanging from the ceiling all over the laboratory. So my role in this event was I was a senior medical advisor to the USAMRIID commander and the overall coordinator of the response. So we ended up having to essentially tear everyone out of their day job, set up a crisis response team. I was coordinating potential use of investigational products with the Food and Drug Administration. We really didn't have anything, but there were a couple things that showed a little bit of promise in monkeys recently at the time, and so we tried to see if we could get those in case we needed them. And then, of course, I had to deal with the press. And then, much like occurs with any crisis, the Army and the Pentagon starts looking for somebody to blame. So I had to deal with some of that, the flack we were getting from the Pentagon. And then I tried to keep in touch with the state health authorities so they knew what was going on. But in the end, of course, we had 21 days of nail biting, and there were a lot of various slips along the way and some things that caused us concern. But in the end, she did well, and here she is on her day of exit from the Slammer after 21 days in lockup. And here's her nurse, and they wrote up this mock newsletter, says the prisoner is now released from the Slammer. So we all breathed a sigh of relief when she came out. But here's some of the lessons learned. When you have a crisis, you have to build a team, and you have to do it very quickly and adapt procedures, much like our hospitals have had to adapt on the fly, essentially building the plane while it's flying. And then it's important to keep the leadership as well as it's important to have leadership and then keep communication amongst the various players, whether it's the internal folks on the team or the health department or the media. And this keeps everybody kind of in synchrony. So over the course of my career, I've developed a number of different skill sets, starting out with just an underpinning in infectious disease and public health, learning about containment, both in the laboratory and the healthcare setting. The military's put me in charge of various things, and I've also done work in the field and learned about biodefense. And now a lot of the work I do is related to research. But what do you do with all these skill sets in the military? Well, what they like to do with you is they like to send you off to war. So here's 2003. I was sent on as part of what's called the Special Medical Augmentation Response Team, or SMART team, for investigational drugs. And we had a group of us who were sent over there for Operation Iraqi Freedom to Kuwait to basically bring over certain investigational products that we might need to use in case we were slimed by some biological weapons from Iraq across the border. So here we are on our way out to the Comfort hospital ship, which you may have seen in the news recently, cruising into New York Harbor to help out with the response. But we're on our way to go train up the medical team out at the Comfort. And then here we are. Here's me with my medical colleagues on the team, and we're outside a bunker in the headquarters at Camp Doha in Kuwait. And so this is what these bunkers would look like. If there was ever a Scud missile alert, the sirens would go off, and then we'd have to go duck in some of these bunkers for 15, 20 minutes until we got the all clear. And then here I am in the middle of one of these episodes. Well, I'm giving a brief to one of the combat support hospitals. As you could see, it's not like a regular hospital. It's a bunch of canvas. It's a tent. But I'm giving a brief to them about the Iraqi program, what to watch out for. And in the middle of this was the day before the shock and awe campaign for the attack on Iraq. And we got the alert, the sirens went off, and then all of us donned our face masks in case we got slimed with a weapon, either chemical or biological. And then we probably should have stepped inside a bunker, but I ended up just giving my brief and yelling through my face mask and completing the brief. Not necessarily the smartest thing. So we'll move on to response to an international crisis. Well, you may be aware that in 2018, there was an Ebola outbreak that started in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It continues to this day. And in fact, we thought it was over, but then a couple of weeks ago, they found a couple more cases. So they're still working through that. But the WHO, or the World Health Organization, designated 4 countries for priority for preparedness. And one of them was Burundi here, as you can see, just east of Democratic Republic of Congo. And so I went over there working for the WHO as the chief of preventive medicine to help them prepare for Ebola in case it came across the border. So here I am. This is my office. As you can see, it's fairly austere. The good thing is most of the time we had electricity, and maybe 3/4 of the time the internet worked. So we could do most of our work. But as you can see, it's not, it's fairly austere setting. One of the things I did is I went around and I trained some burial teams because of the problem with Ebola and the need to have people, trained up and to do it safely, to bury patients safely so that they don't get exposed to the virus themselves and get infected. And the other thing I did is I traveled around the country doing hospital preparedness assessments. And then after I did this, I visited 10 hospitals, and then I made a report for the Minister of Health and then briefed the task force on that. But you could see here, maneuvering around a place like Africa is not quite the same as maneuvering around the United States. So you can see this is the rainy season. Every day the roads were flooded with, and they'd be covered with mud. So you need to really have a pretty decent 4-wheel drive, as well as it took you about 4 times as long to go anywhere in the country. So it was quite cumbersome and slowed things down. But some of the lessons learned from this is just knowing and respecting the enemy, which is Ebola here, because I think once you know what you're dealing with, it's a lot easier to prepare. In an environment like that, you have to expect a different pace. And then, it's a foreign environment. You're not there for very long, so you learn to respect the locals because they understand the lay of the land and what actually is feasible in the setting, and then they all in turn will help you and respect you as well. So let's look forward now, and how do we respond to the next crisis? Well, Louis Pasteur said, in the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. Well, as I say in chapter 23 of my book, it's merely a matter of time until the next mysterious illness emerges. We know only one thing for certain: something else will come along when we least expect it, and it will be something we don't anticipate. So why do we need to worry about this? Well, I think we've seen that Mother Nature is a very efficient bioterrorist, if not the most efficient. So we've seen new diseases like SARS, MERS, Zika virus, chikungunya, and Ebola. And so what's next on the horizon? Well, I think, I used to ask this in my courses, and then now, of course, we know what's next. It's COVID-19. And, it's interesting. We're sort of in the blame part of things now and the armchair quarterbacking phase of this. But I think we had very early warnings, not only watching what China was doing in terms of shutting down half their country to try to prepare for this in the middle of it, but we also saw from this Diamond cruise ship how dangerous it was. So I was interviewed for a session for Reuters in February 11th, 2020. I said, related to this Diamond Princess cruise ship off the coast of Japan, I said the ship infections pointed to an agent that is highly transmissible, at least in closed environments. The virus is unforgiving, and there's no room for error in the use of personal protective equipment and hygiene. A small number of virus particles is likely needed to infect, making it an efficient spreader. And so that's the understatement of the century. Well, here's what the outbreak curve looks like now. If you can look at this in terms of numbers of cases on the y-axis and then time on the x-axis, this is what China had back then. That was their big blip on this radar screen. But look what's happened at the rest of the world. We had this massive rise, this exponential rise in the outbreak curve here. And there's all this talk about bending the curve. Well, in some ways you could say we've bent the curve. We don't continue to go exponentially, but we've sort of flattened the curve. But we're still just flat. We haven't seen a decline. Maybe Europe, if you look here, Europe is in orange. Maybe it's starting to decline. Certainly the US is far from declining. And you can see it, if any case, that it's fairly variable day to day. So what's the fundamental problem with this disease? Number one is it's highly transmissible, similar to influenza. And what makes it easier is the fact that no one has any immunity to this in the underlying population. So it's like giving the virus an open highway to speed down instead of giving the virus like flu, where people actually have some immunity, or there's a vaccine where the flu has to actually stop on the highway periodically, either to get gas or to pay a toll. And so the other thing is we've seen, obviously, it's more severe in certain populations, and we really have no countermeasures right now. So combining this transmissibility and severity is what's made this great impact. And we really have no idea how to treat this. I think we're learning along the way, but we don't have a magic bullet. And I think as a result, there's a lot of snake oil being used out there. And as my colleague at University of Nebraska, Andre Khalil, says, the administration of any unproven drug is as a last resort wrongly assumes that the benefit will be more likely than harm. And I think part of the reason we do this in the medical system is that we don't know what to do. And so we try to reach for anything that has any shred of hope to try to give that patient some benefit if possible. But we also have to keep in mind that there may also be harm. And if you think about this in the context of what happened in West Africa with Ebola, I talk about the graveyard of Ebola drugs that were used there. And some of these drugs you hear about even now, hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, favipiravir, and some other ones that in the end just didn't work, and some may have been harmful in the end. Now, the one thing I never have to worry about is job security, and you've seen this in the news over and over again about this, whether or not this thing originated in the Wuhan laboratory. It's anybody's guess. My own feeling about this is it's probably low likelihood, but I'm a little more suspicious than most people just because I know what errors can happen in laboratories, as well as the fact that I was in the military and know about bioweapons programs and things like that. So I'm not willing to discount it, but I think it's probably low likelihood, and most likely this probably came from bats and some kind of natural exposure. Now, I talked about the slammer, and really USAMRIID was the model that eventually many places around the country adopted, and they set up their own what we call a biocontainment unit, much like the Slammer. This is the one at Emory University, and this is the one at University of Nebraska. And these are very similar to the Slammer, except they don't have the ability to use the space suits, but they have many other features that are similar. But USAMR had started it all. And my job right now is I coordinate a research network amongst 10 facilities that have these types of biocontainment units. You can see the names on the right. But one of the things we've done recently is we partnered with the NIAID, the National Institutes of Health, on a study on a drug called remdesivir. So you may have heard about that in the news lately. The nice news is that it appears to shorten the time till someone improves from 15, 11 days, but it's not necessarily a magic bullet. So it's maybe one step forward, but it's not the be all and end all. So we haven't heard the full report yet. Hopefully we'll hear the final results of that in the next week or two from NIAID. But we had 10 centers working on this and had about 28% of the patients were enrolled at our sites. So recently, it's kind of hard to keep me down and keep me from traveling because I'm just used to going to the field and I kind of enjoy it. And so this is the island of Dominica in the Caribbean. I was asked by the Pan American Health Organization to go to the Caribbean to help some of the nations there prepare for coronavirus. And so this is about a month ago. And this is Dominica. It's a beautiful island. Unfortunately, it looks better than it sounds because I didn't get to see much of the island. This is more what I was doing, going around to their hospitals and assessing them for preparedness and looking for potential risks for infection prevention and control so their healthcare providers wouldn't get infected. And here we are in another island, Antigua, talking with the Minister of Health there about his quarantine unit that he was developing. So what are some of the lessons we've learned about this virus? Well, I think we failed to heed some of the early warnings. Despite all our preparations and all the things we've been doing, talking about pandemic preparedness, we still clearly remain vulnerable, and we were kind of caught unawares, really. Communication is still very important in this, and having some kind of coordinated communication and having a crisis response team with unity of effort. We've seen a lot of disparate efforts, various states doing completely different things. That's, I think, not helpful in the overall response to this. But I think, as I said, the medical system is often very good at adapting, and we are slowly adapting and learning about the enemy. We kind of know more about where it hides on common use items now, like cell phones, your remotes on the floors, toilets, doorknobs, etc. We have a better understanding how it spreads, who actually is infected, but we certainly need more diagnostics to understand who actually is infected, and then who is at highest risk for severe disease. So if I think back now along what I've done in my career, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of cool things. I've been to the White House occasionally to help out with various things, not for this outbreak, but this is back when I was teaching some of the White House medical units about biodefense some time ago. It hasn't always been fun. Here I am sleeping on a bench, and I've slept in more places like that than I care to say, but it also hasn't been half bad. This is a meeting of NATO that we held in Norway, and it's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it. This is actually one of our meetings, our biodefense panel, which I used to co-chair, and they couldn't afford to put us up in a hotel in Oslo, so instead they put us on this cruise ship, and we cruised down the fjords of Norway for 4 days. Most of the time we were stuck in a hot room and where I was kind of falling asleep, but we could still see the beautiful mountains going by. But we thought we'd do one picture at the end, making it look like we were having a lot of fun. But sadly, I'll probably never step foot in another cruise ship after what's happened with COVID-19. But anyway, it was kind of an interesting adventure. So for me, though, through my career, in the end, it's really been all about working with great people, having a shared mission, shared frustrations, but working together to improve things. But ultimately, you can never go wrong as long as you have the focus on these folks here on the stretcher, the patients. So in the end, I started out wanting to be like Hawkeye Pierce, but as my career has unfolded, I really have kind of evolved to someone more like, for those who've seen the movie Outbreak, more like the Dustin Hoffman character, formerly in the military and cruising around the world trying to do some cool things to stop outbreaks. So as I said at the beginning, I wrote this book recently, Inside the Hot Zone. It's now been published. It's about the various crises I dealt with while working mostly in the containment laboratory, but it all goes all the way up to the outbreak of 2008, where I have a little bit just talking about going over to Burundi. But I like to say it's from anthrax to Ebola and everything in between. And it's about not only bioweapon defense crises, but also some natural outbreaks we got involved in, and just some of the challenges and opportunities, and how difficult it is in this space to work sometimes. And it's written like a medical thriller. It's not necessarily only for people who love science, because actually it's written for just about anybody. So you don't have to be a science person to enjoy it. So if anybody's interested, feel free to read more about it at my website, markkortepeter.com, or follow me on Twitter there. Or if anybody has questions beyond what we discussed today, feel free to send me an email, mark.kortepeter@gmail.com. And finally, I'm also a contributor, as you heard at the beginning, to what's called the COVID Frontline series on Forbes.com. So if you look up Kortepeter COVID Frontlines, you'll find my articles. I've written 4 so far, and this is the different subjects. The most recent one I wrote was about, because there's all this talk about the Wuhan laboratory, I talked about some of the ways a pathogen could escape from a lab, even though it's unlikely. So I'll stop there and take any questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. This was a wonderful lecture. I have your book. I highly recommend it. My husband got it for me on Valentine's Day, so I'm lucky to have your autograph in it. But my background is infectious diseases, so I've been following you for quite a while, and maybe since 2004. But again, like you said, you don't have to be a science major to enjoy the book. It's a great book, and it's easy to read, and I highly recommend it for everybody that wants a good thriller. And we have some questions from our board members, and we're going to start off with Ron. He has a question for you.
Okay, here goes. Dr. Kortepeter, I was very interested in your information about anthrax, because when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm in dairy country. And back then, when a farmer had anthrax in his herd, he had to kill all the cattle, put them in a big pit, burn the carcasses, cover the carcasses up, and not graze the land for 40 years. Do they still do that?
I don't know if they do that, but certainly individuals who work with large animals who know about anthrax, especially along the old cattle trains, periodically there are cases of anthrax in the animals, and sometimes humans get infected, usually cutaneous anthrax. But what happens is if an animal dies of it, usually they'll defecate some bloody diarrhea, and then when the organism gets into the air, it will sporulate, and so essentially the animal will die, and then it contaminates the local ground around there. And so because the spore is very hardy, it's like a seed, that area will stay contaminated for decades. And so it's impossible to essentially know where these areas of contamination are. But if they identify where they are, that's really the only way to do it. So somehow, bury the area, or usually what they do is they'll keep cattle or other animals from even going near the area where if they can figure out where the animal is infected. So, and this is part of the reason they want to bury the animals too. They don't want to have further potential spread to their flocks or for their animals. But one of the other things I should mention is, you may recall, or you may have heard, there was an island off the coast of Scotland called Grenard Island. And, in addition to the US, other countries had bioweapons programs. Canada was one, UK was one, and the UK was doing testing of aerosol they would release a sort of an aerosol on the island, and they would test it against sheep downwind to see how effective it was for infecting downwind. And so parts of the island actually got contaminated with spores while they're doing this testing around World War II. Well, it turns out even decades later, they could still find the viable spores in the soil. And so they ended up having to do this massive effort where they trickled formaldehyde over the surface of the part of the island and mixed with seawater. And eventually they could say they decontaminated the island. And finally, after, not until the 1980s did they allow sheep back on the island to graze. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, hi, this is Joanne Horn. That was great talk, Mark. They've actually found viable anthrax spores in soil specimens from the Royal Academy collections going back to the 1500s or 1600s. So they're very long-lived.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons, actually. That's one of the properties that makes anthrax one of the ideal bio.
Sure. Yeah.
I call it the queen because of its downwind spread. Essentially, like the queen on the chessboard, it can essentially go anywhere on the chessboard at long distances and knock out the enemy. And it's and part of the reason is because it's ideal because an adversary can grow it up, sporulate it, and then they essentially can put it on a shelf and they've got it ready to use whenever they need it in the future.
Right. So I've got a question, concerning the current situation. Do you think that they're ever going to be able to pull together an adequate testing program for COVID and, have a kind of nationally coordinated response? Or is this just going to go haphazardly on its nilly-willy way?
Well, I suspect we'll probably get better tests. Of course, the push to get antibody tests, it seems like there's some better tests now coming online. And now that the FDA's kind of gotten a better handle on it. Unfortunately, what happens with this is that I like to say no good deed goes unpunished. So, everybody's saying, hey, the FDA, we need to be able to test antibody tests. So they say, okay, feel free to use your own test. And then it turns out they're crap. And then the FDA gets punished for trying to make it easier, and then they have to sort of draw back. And then, so they can't win really. So,
yeah, but even the active, viral qPCR tests there's not enough, and there's.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, you're right. I think unfortunately the idea we're going to have a coordinated national program, I think we're way beyond that. It's probably not going to happen. As we've seen, the administration is sort of turfing this to the states to figure it out. So perhaps states within a state, they can have more coordinated testing. And it's going to sort of be required to some degree, I think, as more places open up. They may start requiring their employees to be tested, or campuses may require testing.
Right.
So I don't know if it's going to be all coordinated, but hopefully we have better tests and more rapid tests, such as a saliva test and things like that. So it can be done more efficiently and hopefully cheap enough that it can be done frequently until we sort of see a lower level spread in the population.
Right.
David, do you want to ask Mark your question?
Yes. Hey, Mark, it was a great presentation. Los Angeles Times reported a study of a mute coronavirus that can be more contagious. Did you hear about that?
Is this the idea of different strains of the coronavirus?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether to believe that yet. I know some of the scientists have looked at this in terms of whether there's any strains that are more or less easy to spread from this one, SARS-CoV-2. I haven't seen anything that confirms that scientifically. And clearly, I think you even saw early on this thing was highly contagious, even looking at what was happening in China and then with those cruise ships. So I don't think, it's already pretty contagious. I don't know if there's something even more contagious.
But because the testing is so, poor, there's just, and it's not well distributed, it's hard to know how contagious something is.
Right. It's pretty ridiculous, actually, this late.
Yeah, big
Still
time.
don't have a good sense of what's the real death rate overall? Because we have
Right.
an idea about what's the denominator of the population that was infected that really didn't have a problem.
Right.
And so is it really as the same deadliness as flu, or is
Right.
it 10 times it? Is it 20 times it? We don't really know.
Yeah.
Regardless of how deadly it really is, though, I think one of the fundamental challenges with this, regardless of the death rate, is that it is, even though someone doesn't die from it, it is still fairly affecting, 15 to 20% of people, at least as far as we can tell, end up having to be in the hospital. That's a huge
Right.
amount of people being affected. And
Yeah.
it's probably just by the fact that most people aren't immune to this, and they're highly susceptible.
Now, another question, Mark, part of the question. Do you think this virus will go dormant and then pick back up in the wintertime?
It's hard to know. I was just looking I have a friend of mine who's kind of like a genius, and he's one of the guys who developed the BioFire tests, and he's doing some independent work. And he and I were looking at some of the tracking of over time of various respiratory viruses, and we were looking at the common coronaviruses that are tested. And it's interesting that they have a very seasonal predilection. And so it's very possible that we may see a decline along the same seasonal predilection that we see with the other coronaviruses, and then have it resurge again. I have a feeling it's going to be with us. Unlike SARS, we were able to knock SARS out pretty quickly, but I don't think, we're far beyond being able to ever knock this one out. And so I think it'll keep coming back. The question is, how many people before it comes back next will have been infected during this wave, such that we have fewer people, fewer susceptible people to be infected in the next wave. We probably don't have enough people in the population infected yet to provide enough herd immunity to block spread. So I think we're still susceptible for another wave, but it may not happen till, it may die down in the summer, but then come back again about when this hit in the, maybe the late November, December, January timeframe. So maybe this one has more of a winter predilection like flu. We'll just have to see.
I was going to ask you about the PCR BioFire from your friend, because I'm a big fan of the PCR BioFire equipment. And I guess, is that company kind of thinking about maybe doing a machine or a piece of equipment that could run samples a lot more faster? I mean, it's a fast piece of equipment, but you can't do that many samples all at once.
Yeah, I can't speak for what they're doing, other than I think I think they're probably going to come out with it. I don't think there's a test for COVID on BioFire at this time, but obviously they do for other respiratory viruses. I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually do one. But
how do you feel about Abbott's sensitivity test? Do you worry about false positives with some of the testing?
I'm trying to think, is the Abbott test the one that's recently been given some approval by FDA to be used?
Yeah.
It's one of the. It's
the 15-minute one.
Say that again.
It's the 15-minute one. I guess they can run the test in 15 minutes. Yeah,
I don't remember if I'm thinking correctly, that has a pretty high sensitivity and specificity. Okay. And of course, the challenge is any drop in either one of those. If you're testing a population now, those of you who have had your biostatistics will remember Bayes' theorem. Essentially, if you have something that doesn't have good sensitivity and specificity, if you test a population that has low prevalence of disease, you have a much higher chance of a false positive. Whereas if you test a place like New York City, where there's probably a lot of high prevalence now, if you get a positive test, chances are you're right. So,
Mark,
so you really need a test.
Sorry to interrupt. I've got a question. I'm not sure how much time we've got left. I had a question about your presentation itself. If you could go back to the page that shows the bar graph with the evolution of the infection across the world.
Oh, sure. Yeah, the graph.
Yeah, I basically I'm always worried about these kinds of graphs. They seem to be oversimplifying the situation. But what I was really wondering about was, what is the proportion of a population that's infected for each of these lines. Do we know whether this is proportional, or is this just an absolute? I think it's just an absolute number, but I thought there might be a proportional.
No, this is just cases. So we have,
Okay.
that's the problem. Except for places like South Korea, where they've done extensive testing throughout the population, or Singapore, we don't really have an idea what the real prevalence is, and in the population. So all this is numbers of cases reported. No, this is actually numbers of deaths reported in a given day.
Oh, so this is not even okay.
And in fact,
that says number as cases in the title line, not
let's
deaths.
see. Oh yeah, cases. Yeah, these are deaths actually. So
okay, so it's mislabeled too.
Yeah, so you can see. I think. Yeah, I'm pretty. Unless this is. Let me just. No, this actually may be. No, this is number of cases. Sorry.
Oh,
Number
okay.
of cases. The deaths is up top. So you can see the total number of 3.4 million cases by this time, with 239,000 deaths.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm interested about sending or presenting these kinds of graphs that get into the media, and somebody says, "Oh, look, this neighborhood next door to me has got 14 times as many cases." Well, the neighborhood has got 30 times as many people in it.
Right. Yeah. No, that's true.
All
yeah.
right.
No, this does not. This does not go with denominators.
Thank you.
Yeah. The problem is too. This is, as you sort of allude to, this is actually diagnosed cases. It doesn't account for all, you could do sort of modeling, and these guys do modeling about how many cases there are. And actually, one of my articles for Forbes, I talk about, can you believe the models? Because the models it's like they blow with the wind. It all depends on what are your assumptions that go into the model that determines how many cases. And that's why it's important to just understand them and be a little bit skeptical. As they say, not all models are correct, but some are useful.
Yeah,
So,
context is important. Okay, thank you.
So Dr. Mark, I have a question about antibodies. So there's a lot of, people wondering about the serum, and you're the expert in the anti-serum and antibodies, and have experience with SARS. So do you think the antibody, once you acquire COVID or you fight off the infection, do you feel we would have a lasting effect with these antibodies?
That's a good question. And I think the answer is we have no clue. Now,
Okay.
there are tests being done, studies being done now with convalescent plasma from patients who were previously infected and using it as a treatment. So we'll see whether that provides benefit. I will say that the fact that someone actually recovers from illness means that something about their body has provided some level of immunity, whether it's antibodies or their cellular immunity, to be able to fight off the infection. Now, the question really becomes, how long does that immunity last? Will it last, it's so-called what we call sterile immunity, it would essentially knock out the virus for the future completely, or does it mean that people might get a mild illness later? And some of that really may rely on the properties of the virus almost more than the human. So think about flu. Why does flu come back every year? Because most people in the population by now, by the time they're a certain age, will have been exposed to flu at least once. So why do they keep getting infected? It's because the flu virus mutates and has a lot of errors as it mutates right over and over. And so you get what's called the antigenic drift over time. So it slightly changes the proteins every time, such that by the time it comes back the next season, it's different enough that your body can't fully recognize it. Your response may be enough to reduce the severity of infection, but maybe not to completely prevent it. That's why you need a new flu vaccine every year. Now, it appears that this virus does not mutate as easily. It has a better way to sort of fix the errors as it replicates. And so hopefully, maybe that immunity will be a little more long lasting for people. And it's interesting, we really don't have a clue. Why does, other than we know that people as they get older, they do worse. Or if they have other diseases like hypertension, heart disease, lung disease, they do worse. Diabetes, they do worse. But we don't understand why one person like a 75-year-old individual does okay and gets over these, maybe even has asymptomatic disease, and then some 30-year-old dies. Is that because they've had some prior exposure to other coronaviruses? Is it some other genetic, nutritional, who knows what factor? But that's one of the key things that we need to try to figure out is look at these outliers. Why does the 30-year-old or 40-year-old die, but not the 70-year-old? And try to figure out what are those properties that may distinguish them.
Well, I've been reading all the journals that have been coming out from China, Sweden, and trying to keep up with everything. And I did read one study on blood typing. Did you read that one by any chance about if you're O blood type, you may be less susceptible to getting COVID infection? And what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know if I saw that specific study, but I did hear that. But I haven't seen, I'd be curious to know. That'd be a great example where you test the two types of individuals and see what if there are other properties that provide benefit or not, Yeah, it's completely unknown, I think, at this point, other than knowing you have things that impair your immune system already, or because this disease really has a high burden, on the cardiovascular system, in terms of if you drop your oxygen levels because your lungs aren't able to oxygenate, that puts a huge pressure on your heart and your ability to, increase your heart rate, and it makes you susceptible to some type of heart attack. Or the other interesting thing we're finding are this phenomenon of blood clotting. So there was just a paper yesterday about where the individuals who they put on full anticoagulation who were on ventilators appeared to survive longer and had lower death rates than those who didn't get the full anticoagulation. So, what is it about this virus that might be triggering these clots? We have no idea, but it's fascinating what we're going to learn about some of the physiology of this eventually, once we sort of catch up.
Yes, exactly. I think it's going to be a while.
Well, the other thing is I wrote an article, one of my next Forbes articles, if they ever publish it, is try to look at, what happens, there's this strange new phenomenon in children that they're reporting out in New York.
I saw that too.
Kawasaki's like disease. Well, we've always presumed Kawasaki's was likely related to some type of virus, but we could never identify it. Maybe we're going to find out more about that through this virus. If indeed these cases really are COVID related, or maybe they just are Kawasaki's because it's that time of year for Kawasaki's.
Very interesting. Terry, did you have a question to ask?
No, just a comment. My daughter is a nurse at Johns Hopkins in the COVID biocontainment unit, and her outfit looks like the one you showed, except she doesn't have the hose. She just, apparently they have a bottle that they can attach.
Yeah, well, they have what's called a PAPR, so they have usually a pressurized air system, just sits on the belt.
Right.
Filter. Yeah, I know those guys up at Hopkins. I've been to their unit. They've got a really nice biocontainment unit there. I know some of the ID docs there.
She's on the 4th floor, I think it is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, we want to thank you, Mark, for doing this for the Washington Academy of Sciences. We were very honored to have you here tonight, and very lucky considering the circumstances as you're traveling and, trying to do the COVID stuff and promote your book. And again, I encourage everybody to get Mark's book. If you want more details about this lecture, it's all in here. And again, we look forward, and we hope that you do okay while you go back out to the field and work on COVID.
Right. Well, I appreciate the attention, and it's been fun. So good luck to all you guys too, as you're hunkering down at home.
Mark, last question. Do you have any objection to us posting this on other websites?
No, feel free. Send it far and wide. Here, I'll put the last picture up here for anybody Oh yeah, feel free to post it wherever you want to. I appreciate free the free advertisement.
Okay, cool.
Again, thank you so much. We truly appreciate it.
All right, well, you guys take care. Thank you, and have a good evening. Have a nice weekend.
You too.